Rhett Calloway signed the divorce papers without asking for the house, without asking for the savings account, and without making a single move toward the last car sitting in the garage. He walked into that courthouse hallway carrying nothing but a small wooden box. His ex-wife, Mallory Quinn, laughed out loud the moment she saw it. "You're really leaving with nothing," she said, loud enough for the attorneys and her mother both to hear. Her brother Preston called Rhett, a man who had lived off his wife's money for years. Rhett said nothing. He tucked the box under his arm and walked toward the exit. 3 weeks later, the final property hearing was scheduled. Mallory stepped out of the courthouse doors, and there was Rhett, stepping out of a black Aston Martin. Stay with this story, because the reason a man who walked away with nothing came back in that car will change the way you understand what losing actually looks like. The courthouse on Hargrove Street had seen 100 divorce proceedings that year alone, and most of them followed the same brutal rhythm. Accusations traded across a conference table, lawyers performing theater, while two people who had once loved each other tried to take everything that wasn't bolted down. Rhett Calloway's case was quieter than most. He sat across from Mallory's legal team on a Tuesday morning and listened while her attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Gerard Holt, cataloged the marital assets with the meticulous enthusiasm of an auctioneer working through a high-value estate. The house on Whitmore Lane, with its renovated kitchen and 3-car garage, the joint savings accounts, the investment portfolio, the furniture, the SUV, the wine collection Mallory had spent 3 years building from scratch, and the patio furniture she had imported from a craftsman in Vermont. Rhett listened to all of it and nodded, and then Warren Tate, his own attorney, a calm and careful man who had handled enough divorce cases to recognize something unusual when he saw it, looked at his client with something that landed between professional confusion and genuine concern. Rhett Calloway was not a man who made a large impression in a room. He was 41 years old, lean and unhurried, with hands that bore the particular calluses that come from working around machinery rather than sitting behind a desk. He had spent the better part of the last decade working as a technical consultant for high-performance mechanical systems, the kind of work that takes place in industrial facilities and private engineering shops rather than glass-walled offices, the kind that requires a quality of precision most people never develop, no matter how long they try. He had traveled for the work, taken contracts across the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest, spent weeks at a time away from the house on Whitmore Lane while Mallory attended events, and kept the kind of social calendar that her family considered a professional obligation rather than a personal preference. To the Quinn Hayes family, Rhett's absence from those events confirmed what they had suspected from the beginning. He was not the right man for Mallory. A man who traveled to machine shops when he could have been building relationships with the right people was a man pointing himself in the wrong direction. The marriage had been fracturing long before either Rhett or Mallory was willing to say so out loud. Mallory had grown up inside money, not the explosive, first-generation kind, but the settled, institutional kind that comes with a set of assumptions about how the world works and what a person's life is supposed to look like. Her mother, Veronica Hayes, had built Quinn Hayes Capital from a regional investment firm into something with real weight in the market. And she had raised her daughter to understand that status was not merely desirable but functional, that the right associations opened the right doors, and that a husband's primary professional value was in the signal he sent to the world rather than in the specifics of what he actually did. Mallory had married Rhett, believing he would evolve into something more legible to her family's framework. She had assumed his quietness was temporary, that the right environment would expand him, and that underneath the technical work there was a version of Rhett Calloway who would eventually want the things she wanted. That version never appeared. Rhett remained what he had always been. He worked on what interested him. He earned well from his consulting contracts, contributed consistently to the household finances, and spent the hours he wasn't working in the garage behind the house, where he kept a workbench, several hundred precision tools, and a collection of technical drawings that Mallory had never found the patience to look at closely. As the years accumulated and the distance between them widened, Mallory began interpreting Rhett's constancy not as stability but as stagnation. She told him he wasn't ambitious. She told him the garage work was a hobby, not a career. She told him, at a dinner with her family, that he would later think of as the turning point, that his entire professional identity amounted to maintaining other people's machinery rather than building anything of his own. Rhett had heard all of this and had not argued. It was not that he didn't have arguments available. It was that he understood, by that point, that the conversation Mallory wanted to have was not one in which his actual answers mattered. She had already reached her conclusions. What she was doing in those conversations was performing certainty, not genuinely seeking information. When the proceedings were finally over and the documents were signed, the division of assets was complete. Mallory kept the house, the full contents of the joint accounts, the SUV, the wine collection, the furniture, and the patio set from Vermont. Rhett walked away carrying a box of personal items, photographs, a few tools that had been given to him specifically, some books, and 3 technical folders from the garage that Mallory's legal team had not flagged as marital assets because Mallory had described them to Gerard Holt as personal notebooks of no commercial value. Warren Tate had urged Rhett, 3 separate times across 3 separate conversations, to revisit the question of his fair share. Each time, Rhett had declined. He said it with the particular quietness of a man who has already performed the relevant calculations and is not interested in being talked out of the result. In the hallway outside the main conference room, Mallory stood with Veronica and Preston and spoke in the voice she used when she wanted to be heard without appearing to address anyone in particular. He finally admitted he never had anything to bring to the table. Preston laughed first, with the sharp satisfaction of a man who had privately disapproved of Rhett for years and was now watching that disapproval vindicated in real time. Veronica followed with the composed, private smile of a woman who considers herself a reliable judge of people and has just been confirmed in that judgment. Rhett stood at the end of the hallway for a moment, said nothing, and pushed through the glass door into the afternoon. What none of them saw, what none of them would understand until 3 weeks later, was that the man walking away from them in that parking lot was not walking away empty-handed. He was walking away with the only thing he had ever needed. Mallory Quinn did not simply move forward from her divorce. She turned it into a narrative she curated and polished and deployed at every appropriate occasion. She told friends over lunch and colleagues at evening events that she had finally freed herself from a man who had never matched her energy, never understood her ambitions, and had spent 9 years of their marriage treating a garage full of old sketches as though they were more important than their actual life together. The story was compelling in the way stories are compelling when they are mostly true and carefully arranged. Mallory had real grievances. Rhett had been absent in ways that mattered. The distance between them had been genuine, not invented. But the story she was telling left out the part about why the distance had grown. The years of contempt dressed as concern, the dinner party comment about maintaining other people's machinery, the morning she had left a handwritten note on his workbench that said, in her clearest script, "This is not a career." At the courthouse that Tuesday, Preston had been particularly deliberate about positioning himself near Rhett during a brief corridor recess, close enough to speak at low volume, but clearly enough that the words carried. He said that Mallory had been generous throughout the proceedings, and that Rhett ought to recognize that generosity rather than taking it for granted. He said that Mallory's attorneys could have made the consulting fee situations much more complicated than they had. but had chosen not to. Rhett looked at Preston evenly and said that the consulting fees were his own earnings deposited into a joint account, which was not generosity on Mallory's part, but a simple matter of fact. Preston said he was just making the point that things could have gone harder for Rhett, and he should be grateful they hadn't. Rhett said he understood the point and did not find it persuasive. What Rhett did not say, what he said to no one in that courthouse, not even to Warren Tate in their final private conference, was that everything he was preserving had been invisible to Mallory's family for so long that their failure to see it now was not something he needed to correct. The technical drawings in the garage folders were not simply his hobby, not simply his father's legacy, and not simply a sentimental attachment he had been unable to let go of. They were the continuation of one of the most genuinely elegant engineering problems Rhett had ever encountered, and they had been left to him by the one person who had understood their potential completely. Garrett Calloway had been a mechanical engineer of real originality, a quiet man in the way that the best engineers often are, someone who listened more than he talked, and spent more time thinking through a problem than most people spend on a problem in a year. Garrett had worked for 2 decades in industrial applications before turning his attention to high-performance drivetrain systems, specifically to the problem of energy loss during power transmission in vehicles operating near the upper limits of their performance range. It was a problem that had occupied engineers in the field for a long time without producing a satisfying solution. Most approaches to it were incremental, small improvements stacked on existing designs, modest efficiency gains that added up to progress without ever addressing the underlying dynamic. Garrett believed the underlying dynamic was the only thing worth addressing, and he spent the last decade of his life building a framework to address it. He had gotten very close. The drawings left behind when he died were close enough that someone who understood the problem could see exactly how far he had gotten and exactly where the remaining work was. Rhett had understood the problem. Rhett had done the remaining work. He had done it over years, in the garage on Whitmore Lane, between consulting contracts and family obligations, and the slow accumulation of a marriage that was moving in the wrong direction. He had not talked about it with Mallory in any detail, because Mallory had made her position on the subject clear early in their relationship and had not revisited it. In the 2nd year of their marriage, she had told him to stop spending evenings in the garage and focus on the things that actually mattered. In the 4th year, she had suggested he sell the drawings to whoever would take them and use the money for something practical. In the 7th year, she had told her mother over the phone, in a message she had not known Rhett could hear from the hallway, that the garage was full of an old dead man's work, and she couldn't understand why Rhett treated it like something sacred. Rhett had heard that. He had gone back into the garage and continued working. The call from Dorian Blake arrived on a Thursday evening, 4 days after the divorce was finalized. Dorian represented the commercial interests of a British automotive firm that had been quietly monitoring developments in drivetrain efficiency technology for several years, working through a small network of industry contacts who tracked independent research in the field. A consultant Rhett had worked alongside at a technical conference the previous spring had mentioned Rhett's name in connection with the Calloway work. Dorian had read this summary documentation. He said his company had been looking for exactly this kind of foundational innovation, the kind built on first principles rather than iterative modification. He asked whether Rhett was in a position to discuss licensing terms. Rhett sat down in the small house he had just leased, in a room that contained a cot and a table, and not much else, and said yes. In the weeks following the divorce, Mallory found that sustaining the narrative required more effort than she had anticipated. The house looked right. The kitchen photographed well. Her social calendar remained full enough to project normalcy, but there were moments, usually in the early evening when the house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet even during Rhett's absences, when the story she was telling about herself felt slightly too constructed, slightly too dependent on the specific framing she had given it. She pushed through those moments with the force of will that Veronica had modeled for her since childhood. A Quinn Hayes woman did not sit with uncertainty. She replaced it with action. Preston called on a Friday morning with the kind of information he delivered when he wanted to create alarm without appearing to do so. He mentioned, in a tone calibrated to sound casual, that a contact of his in the technical contracting sphere had mentioned Rhett's name in connection with a European automotive interest, something about a technology license, something about drawings. He said he thought Mallory should know, just in case it turned out to be relevant to the property settlement. Mallory listened and felt the first real movement of something uncomfortable. Not quite alarm, but its precursor, the low-frequency signal that something is not arranged the way you thought it was. She covered it quickly with logic. Rhett had been talking about his father's drawings for the entirety of their marriage. If they were worth anything, it would have become apparent before now. And if they were worth something now, surely a lawyer could make an argument that their development during the marriage entitled Mallory to a share. She called Gerard Holt that afternoon. He said the argument was credible. He said the court would likely agree to hear it given the timing. He said to give him a week to prepare the filing. The supplemental hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the original proceedings. Mallory arrived with her team and her family in the kind of coordinated formation that projects confidence, because projecting confidence is the thing you do when you are not entirely confident. She stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the street and said to the people around her that Rhett would probably come the same way he had last time. Preston made a joke. A few people laughed. Then the sound arrived. Not dramatic, not the manufactured noise of something built to be loud. A low, steady, composed growl. The sound of an engine designed by people for whom precision is not an aesthetic choice, but a fundamental commitment. A black Aston Martin DBS Superleggera came around the corner and stopped at the base of the courthouse steps with the unhurried authority of a vehicle that does not need to announce itself. The color was so deep and so perfectly finished that in the overcast morning light, it seemed less like a surface and more like an absence of surface, a shape defined by what it absorbed rather than what it reflected. The door opened. Rhett stepped out in a dark, well-fitted suit and Garrett's watch, and he stood for a moment beside the car before looking up the steps. He did not perform the moment. He straightened his jacket, closed the door with the particular quietness of a man who handles things carefully, and raised his eyes. The group at the top of the steps had gone completely silent. Mallory stood at the center of it with expression that was not quite recognizable as any specific emotion. It was the expression of a person watching their model of reality rearranging itself. Preston said the car was probably rented, that this was theater, that Rhett was performing for effect. Warren Tate, who had been standing to one side with the patient composure of a man who has known the ending of this story for some time, walked over and said, quietly, but not so quietly that it wouldn't carry, that the vehicle was registered to Rhett Calloway and had been purchased outright from the advance payment on a signed technology licensing agreement. Rhett came up the steps and stopped near Mallory on the landing. He looked at her for a moment, without hostility and without satisfaction. Then he said, "You laughed because you thought I walked away with nothing. The truth is I only left behind what was never really mine to begin with." He went inside. Judge Patricia Sohn ran a procedurally clean courtroom. She reviewed briefs in advance, asked precise questions, and had no patience for arguments that substituted rhetorical intensity for factual foundation. She had reviewed the supplemental filing before the hearing and had formed a preliminary sense of the issues, though she reserved judgment in the professional sense and the personal one. She opened the session by asking counsel for both parties to proceed. Gerard Holt presented first, and he was thorough. The technology in question, he argued, had been substantially developed during the marriage, within the marital home, in a physical space, the garage on Whitmore Lane, that constituted a marital asset. The years during which this development occurred were years in which Mallory's income had helped maintain the household stability that made Rhett's work possible. The commercial value now being attributed to the intellectual property was inseparable from the conditions that the marriage had provided. He cited case law on the treatment of intellectual property developed during marriage and asked the court to consider an equitable share of the proceeds for his client. Warren Tate laid the response out with the organized calm of a man who has more documentation than he needs and has chosen which pieces to show first. He began with provenance. The original technical drawings bore Garrett Calloway's signature and a date predating the marriage by more than 2 decades. Every significant conceptual element of the underlying system could be traced directly to Garrett's original work. Rhett's contribution had been genuine and substantive, but it had been a continuation of an existing body of work with a clear prior ownership lineage. He then produced Rhett's development records, the dated notebooks, the equipment purchase receipts, the invoiced consulting income that had funded the research, none of which involved the joint accounts. He acknowledged that the garage was physically part of the marital home. He said that a workspace is not the same as a creative or financial contribution to the work produced in it, and that conflating the two was precisely the kind of argument that sounds plausible until it is examined. Dorian Blake testified briefly, in the composed manner of a man who chooses his words because he values accuracy rather than effect. He confirmed the terms of the licensing agreement. He confirmed that his company had sought out the Callaway technology specifically because of its engineering lineage. The original Garrett Callaway innovation was the foundation of the commercial value, not an incidental background detail. He confirmed that no aspect of the evaluation had been premised on any business infrastructure, financial partnership, or institutional backing associated with the Quinn Hayes family. When Gerard pressed him on whether the marital context had facilitated the development in any way, Dorian said he had no way to make that determination, but that what his company had paid for was the technology and its provenance, and the provenance was Callaway, not Quinn. Mallory had not been expecting the number Dorian's testimony implied. She passed a note to Gerard. Gerard confirmed it. She put the note face down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. Then Warren asked the court to consider a set of archived communications. He had obtained them from Rhett's records, backed up messages, emails recovered from cloud storage, and one audio recording. He described them without editorializing as evidence relevant to the question of whether any party had ever treated the technical work as a shared marital asset during the course of the marriage. Judge Sohn reviewed them. The picture they painted was remarkably consistent across years and platforms. In an email to Veronica from the 3rd year of the marriage, Mallory had written that Rhett's garage project was a dead-end obsession he should have outgrown years ago. In a message to Preston from the 6th year, she had referred to the Callaway drawings as old blueprints that should have been thrown out when his father died. In a direct exchange with Rhett himself, she had instructed him to stop wasting time on drawings that will never be worth anything and focus on actual work. The voicemail was brief. Mallory's voice was clear and completely unhurried as she told her mother that the garage was full of a dead man's old ideas, and she honestly wished Rhett would just let it go. The room was very still during the playback. Preston looked at the table. Veronica sat with the controlled stillness of someone who is managing a complex internal experience by presenting nothing at all externally. Gerard objected to the characterization of the communications as legally relevant. Warren said he was not characterizing them. He was simply placing before the court a documented record of how the party now seeking ownership had consistently evaluated the asset across a period of years. He said that a party who categorically and repeatedly treats an item as having no value and who fails to identify it as a marital asset in the original proceedings cannot reasonably return to assert ownership the moment commercial value appears on the other side of a finalized judgment. Rhett was offered the opportunity to speak. He said only this: "I didn't conceal the work from Mallory. I discussed it with her many times over many years. I asked for her interest and her support more than once. What I received in return was consistent direction to discard it. I kept it because it was my father's work and because I believed it was worth something. Everything that came after the divorce is the result of that belief, and nothing else." The recess lasted just under half an hour. When Judge Sohn returned, the room had the particular quality of silence that descends over people who already know the outcome and are performing the ritual of waiting for it to be formalized. Mallory sat with her hands still on the table, not fidgeting, not checking anything, just sitting with the composure of a woman for whom composure had become so habitual that it continued operating even when everything beneath it was shifting. Preston had stopped looking at his phone. Veronica sat with her spine straight and her expression arranged, though the arrangement required more effort than it usually did. The ruling was clear and not lengthy. The intellectual property in question had originated with Garrett Calloway before the marriage. The development work had been conducted by Rhett Calloway using his own professional resources and income. The marital home had provided physical workspace, but no demonstrable intellectual contribution, financial contribution, or co-creative participation from any other party. The communications entered into evidence established conclusively that the asset had never been treated as a shared marital interest by either party during the marriage. Most specifically, the record showed repeated and unambiguous statements from the party now seeking ownership characterizing the work as without value. The court found no basis for a claim of marital intellectual property. The request for partial ownership of the Callaway technology and its commercial proceeds was denied. Gerard said quietly to Mallory that he would assess the appeal landscape. Mallory nodded without expression. Rhett stood, straightened his jacket with the same unhurried motion he had used on the courthouse steps that morning, and thanked the judge for her time in the measured way of a man who has been raised to be polite in rooms where important things happen. Preston pushed back from the table too quickly. The chair scraped. He said, with the clipped urgency of someone making a last stand, that Rhett had structured the whole situation deliberately, the timing, the documentation, the licensing agreement, all of it designed to arrive in court looking clean, precisely because it had been engineered to look clean. Rhett turned and looked at him without anger, without the heat that Preston's tone was trying to provoke. He said that the work had been done because it mattered to him and to his father's memory, not because of anything to do with Mallory or with the divorce, and that he had never structured anything except the technical problem he was trying to solve. He said that the situation had arranged itself the way it had, because Mallory had decided the drawings were worthless, and decisions made from contempt tend to arrange themselves in patterns that surprise the people who made them. Veronica Hayes said nothing. It was the most conspicuous silence Rhett had ever observed from her. In 9 years of knowing the woman, across 100 occasions where she had delivered an opinion whether it was requested or not, this was the first time she had absolutely nothing to say. The hallway outside the courtroom was the same one where Mallory had stood 3 weeks earlier and projected her victory in a voice meant to be overheard. The same fluorescent light, the same linoleum floor with the slight scuff pattern near the elevator, the same anonymous institutional air of a building where important things happen to ordinary people every day. Mallory walked out ahead of her legal team and stopped near the window at the far end of the corridor, where the glass let in a thin rectangle of gray afternoon light. She stood there for a moment, and then heard Rhett's footsteps and turned. She asked him why he hadn't told her the technology was worth real money. She said it with genuine bewilderment rather than accusation, which was different from most of the registers Mallory had used with Rhett in the later years of their marriage, and which caught him slightly off guard. He considered the question. He said that he had told her, many times, in many different ways, across many years. He had told her the work mattered. He had told her his father had been working on something real. He had told her he believed the problem was solvable, and that he was close to solving it. He had said all of these things in the precise terms available to him, which were the terms of a man who communicates through the quality of his attention rather than the volume of his declarations. She had heard all of those conversations and had filtered them through a framework that evaluated men by the signals they sent to the world rather than the substance of what they were building. The information had been available to her the entire time. She had simply been looking at something else. Mallory said she thought she at least deserved to understand that it was going somewhere concrete. Rhett said that from where he had been standing, it had been going somewhere concrete for years. He said it without reproach, because reproach would have required him to believe she owed him something, and he had stopped keeping that kind of account. She had wanted the house and the money, and the image of the woman who had come out ahead. She had all of that. He had kept the work and the watch and the patience his father had modeled for him across a lifetime of doing things that nobody around him had fully understood. Mallory started a sentence that had the shape of an apology in it, and Rhett listened to the beginning of it and then said, not unkindly, that he didn't need the apology. He said that she had what she had fought for, and he had what he had protected, and he hoped they were both able to do something worthwhile with their respective halves of the arrangement. It was not warmth exactly, but it was not coldness either. It was the tone of a man who has genuinely let go of the narrative, not because he has suppressed it, but because the story he is living now is more interesting than the one about what was taken from him. Dorian Blake appeared at the far end of the hall. Warren shook Rhett's hand with both of his and said something quiet that made them both briefly smile. A small cluster of Mallory's relatives stood near the elevator with the uncertain posture of people who had come prepared to celebrate and were now recalibrating. As Rhett passed them, none of them said anything. Preston moved to intercept him near the exit doors. He said that Quinn Hayes Capital was navigating a difficult stretch, that the clean vehicle project they had been counting on had lost its technology partnership, and that if there was any interest in a conversation, any kind of arrangement that might work for both sides, Preston would be glad to facilitate it. Rhett stopped and looked at him for a moment, with the particular expression of a man who has heard a version of this conversation before and knows exactly what it is. He said he appreciated Preston raising it and genuinely wished Quinn Hayes well. Then he pushed through the glass door. There is a kind of success that announces itself loudly, that builds its identity around what it has taken and what it displays, that requires an audience in order to feel complete. And then there is the other kind, the kind that knows its own value without needing anyone else to confirm it, that moves at the pace of the work rather than the pace of the perception, that can absorb years of being underestimated and keep going because the thing that drives it is real and not contingent on approval. Rhett Calloway was the second kind. He had always been the second kind, and the years inside the Quinn Hayes world had not changed that, only clarified it. He did not keep the small leased house near the machine district. Within 6 months of the hearing, the licensing proceeds had given him options he had not had before, and he made the decision that Garrett Calloway would have recognized immediately. He reinvested in the work. He found a larger property at the edge of a quieter district, still modest by any reasonable measure, still the kind of place you live in because it suits you, rather than because it says something about you, with a proper workshop attached and enough land around it to give the building breathing room. He had the workshop fitted out with the kind of equipment that had always been on Garrett's list, and that neither Garrett nor Rhett had previously been in a position to afford. He named it Callaway Performance Lab, painted the exterior in a deep industrial green that recalled the color of the garage from his childhood, and mounted a small brass plate beside the door with his father's name on it. The Aston Martin lived outside the workshop on days when the weather permitted. Rhett had not bought it as a symbol, exactly, though he was aware that it had become one, both to the people who had stood on those courthouse steps, and to himself in a quieter, more private way. He had bought it because it was the product of a philosophy of engineering that his father had believed in, built by craftspeople who understood that precision is not decoration but principle, that the way a thing is made is inseparable from what the thing is. Driving it was, among other things, a reminder that the kind of work his father had done and that he had continued could produce something like this. That the patient application of genuine understanding to a real problem had consequences in the physical world that outlasted the opinions of people who had not taken the time to understand what they were dismissing. He drove it carefully. He appreciated the way the engine sounded at a steady highway pace. He did not drive it to impress anyone. There was no one he was trying to impress. The scholarship fund had been an idea he'd had during the weeks between the divorce and the hearing, during the quiet evenings in the leased house, when he had been thinking about Garrett and about what the Callaway name meant and what he wanted it to continue meaning. He established it formally in the spring following the proceedings, a small annual scholarship for young people pursuing technical education, specifically in mechanical engineering and drivetrain systems, with a preference for applicants who did not come from families with easy access to credentialed programs. He wanted the work to have a life beyond the two of them. He wanted some young person who was currently sitting in a garage somewhere, building something no one around them thought was worth the time, to one day have a small additional reason to keep going. The first 3 recipients were chosen by a selection committee that Rhett convened with the help of 2 colleagues from the consulting world and 1 contact from the industrial engineering program at a state university. He wrote each of them a letter. He told them that the most important quality in technical work was the willingness to continue when the work refused to resolve quickly, and that the people who had told them their direction was wrong were probably people who had never stayed with a problem long enough to know what staying felt like. Mallory sold the house on Whitmore Lane the following autumn. The financial reality of the property had turned out to be different from the picture she had painted in the weeks after the divorce. The existing mortgage carried obligations that combined with maintenance costs to create a monthly burden larger than her income comfortably supported. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment and engaged a financial advisor to restructure her situation. She was not ruined, and she was not broken. She was simply a person who had confused the image of a victory with the victory itself, and who was now learning, at some cost, what the difference felt like over time. Quinn Hayes Capital contracted. The clean vehicle project that had needed a technology partnership failed to find one in time, and the project collapse had downstream effects on the company's position in a sector it had been trying to expand into. Preston moved laterally into a smaller role with a reduced portfolio. Veronica retired earlier than she had planned, under conditions that did not match the exit she had long imagined for herself. None of this was the consequence of any action Rhett had taken. It was simply the natural result of a set of decisions that had been made from a position of confidence in assumptions that turned out to be wrong. On a late afternoon in the fall, one of those afternoons when the light drops early and comes in sideways through any available window, and turns ordinary things golden. Rhett drove from the house to the workshop and parked outside in the gravel. He sat in the car for a moment after the engine went quiet, not thinking about anything in particular, just absorbing the silence that follows a large engine when it stops, the way the world reasserts itself in the absence of mechanical sound. Then he went inside. The workshop held the particular quality of air that belongs to rooms where focused work happens, a compound smell of metal and oil and heated electrical components, the specific warmth of machinery that has been running and is now resting. High windows let in the last of the afternoon light at a low angle, and it fell across the workbench in a long rectangle that shifted slowly as the sun moved. On the wall to the left of the workbench was a framed photograph of Garrett Calloway. It was not a formal portrait. It was a snapshot taken in the original garage by someone who had not announced they were taking it, showing Garrett from the side, bent over a set of drawings, with the full absorption of a man who has forgotten there is a world outside the problem in front of him. Below the photograph was a mounted print of the first original design drawing, Garrett's handwriting across the title block, the date in the lower corner, 3 decades old, the ink still dark and legible. On the workbench was the old watch. Rhett reached into his jacket pocket and set the Aston Martin key down beside it. The key had the weight and finish of something made without compromise, the kind of object that communicates its own seriousness without trying to. The watch was worn and scratched in the particular way of objects that have been used every day for a lifetime, that carry the accumulated friction of decades of ordinary mornings. He stood there for a long moment looking at the 2 objects side by side on the workbench, the old and the new, the inherited and the earned, the original and the continuation, and felt the specific kind of quiet that comes when a long and complicated story finds its shape. He had walked out of that courthouse 3 weeks after his divorce, carrying a box and a set of folders and the profound, invisible weight of being misunderstood by people whose opinion he had once cared about. He had driven away from Mallory's laughter and Preston's contempt and Veronica's satisfied silence and all the accumulated small humiliations of years inside a family that had decided what he was worth and never revisited the question. He had driven away in a taxi, without ceremony, without a last word, without any of the gestures that would have satisfied the story Mallory was composing about him. And he had come back in a black car that said nothing, and needed to say nothing, because the work spoke in its own language to anyone capable of hearing it. Outside, the low autumn sun caught the flank of the Aston Martin where it sat in the gravel, and the light moved slowly across the body of it, and the black held the color of the late afternoon in a way that felt, for a moment, almost like warmth. The workshop was quiet. The photograph of Garrett Calloway looked down from the wall with the expression of a man who had always known his son would figure it out. No one was laughing now.